Hello everyone, and welcome back to COSS, our course on commercial open source software startups and how to spin one off from university. We are squarely in the middle, or just beyond the middle, of this course in terms of lectures. This is the third lecture in the middle part on commercial open source software and strategies. The next lecture will also be on commercial open source strategies with a specific focus on cloud computing. But today I would like to introduce commercial open source and what I consider the three core strategies or patterns for business models. Of these, single vendor open source firms are the most important one, perhaps, at least by numbers. Then there are open source distributor firms, and finally there are service and support firms. To understand why companies choose a commercial open source strategy, we also need to look at the benefits that this strategy brings to the effectiveness of different business functions. So with that, what is commercial open source? It's actually not that easy to come up with a definition. Mine is commercial open source software is open source software that is being developed by one or more vendors, so there are companies behind it, for the purposes of deriving indirect revenues from it. The crux of this definition is open source software itself, because of the open source license, is always free to use, so you can't make money off it really. You can only make money off something complementary to it. And be it as basic as providing the software for download or putting it on a CD or DVD and distributing it like that. So the revenues generated from the open source software are always indirect, something complementary to it. And that will be the challenge of commercial open source. So users still pay for what we've called a basic or a whole product in the past. That is being provided then by what becomes the commercial open source software vendor, but it is not the open source software itself. To look ahead, why do companies do that? The implication here is develop software and give it away for free as open source software. The purpose of this strategic move is to drive adoption of the software and implicitly then the underlying product in its markets, to drive adoption with users and turn those users eventually into paying customers. Using open source to drive adoption has also been called frictionless distribution. You make it really easy for initially users, possibly later customers, to get acquainted to the software, to start using it. They are, as we will see, a $0 line item in a budget to develop some software or just run some software, because there are no barriers to using it. Quite differently from to pay for software or even for software that has a freemium model or has a trial that expires after 3 months or something like it. And once you are establishing or have established such a base with users, it will be harder for competitors to possibly get their foot in the door with the users and the potential customers. As we will see, the revenue sources, what customers, those users who eventually become customers, actually pay for, that is not new. These are the classic revenue sources that we have already discussed. But then the business functions around it and how to be effective at them changes, is different. Sometimes it's extensions, linear extensions of what's already there. Sometimes it's drastically different, and we will also discuss this today. There are lots of commercial open source firms these days, some of which you may know. So I'm pretty sure you've heard of MySQL or MongoDB, where MongoDB until recently was an open source, commercial open source firm. These 4 pillars here, so 3 companies on top of each other are a pillar, belong to each other for different reasons. On the left, MySQL, MuleSoft, and Pentaho, they're just very different commercial open source firms. So MySQL is a database company, MuleSoft was a database company, MuleSoft was a data integration company, and so forth. So just different types of products. The second column or pillar, Cloudera, Mapper, and Hortonworks, they are, as we will learn, there's commercial open source firms focused on the same base software, here Hadoop. So we will call them later on multi-vendor commercial open source, because it's multiple vendors servicing and deriving products and revenues from one shared community open source software, here Hadoop. A third pillar is different products, different open source software, but same domain. It's 3 database companies, MongoDB, Yugabyte, and ArangoDB are commercial open source database open source software companies. What's common to the first 3 pillars or columns here is it's all individual products that more or less are owned by these companies. And the last column is different in that it's open source distributors. So these companies, Red Hat, Univention, and Mirantis, really don't own much about the software they're using. It's true community open source, but they put them together, and what customers, as we will learn, pay for, or what's attractive to customers, is that these companies take away the integration pain of many different components. So commercial open source is all around you in this software industry. Many of these logos and marks and companies and products you probably knew. And it turns out it's a lucrative approach. Here based on oss.cash, where you can find this spreadsheet, we can see that lots of companies have become unicorns, startups have become unicorns, making or suggesting that a commercial open source strategy is actually helpful achieve that status, or basically just be a successful company with successful exits, warranting the initial investment by venture capitalists into the software product startup, into the vendor. The term commercial open source, I was curious, and a while back, 10 years ago, I asked or confirmed what I knew, that this term had been coined in 2004. The term commercial open source had been coined in 2004 by the commercial open source software firm Sugar CRM, an enterprise software, commercial open source enterprise software for CRM, customer relationship management. They got the initial domain. I think they dropped it by now. It's too generic a term anyway, and too long to be useful. And so this term commercial open source goes back to Sugar CRM. There are competing terms like professional open source, but the one that stuck was commercial open source. And the challenge then is, because of that seeming contradiction between commercial on the one hand and open source, meaning freely available, on the other hand, the challenge will be how to resolve that. So what we know is that software vendors sell products, and that we can structure products into these 3 stages or extensions, core, basic, and whole product. And what we will see is that what commercial open source vendors sell is indeed a basic or whole product, as we have previously introduced it. So they will sell customers something which may include fitness for use or certification guarantees, training and consulting or operations of the product. But the core software itself will also be available as open source. So it's not a traditional license sale for the core software only. Maybe in combination with these other features, it becomes a proper product to pay for product. But the core of the product, hence core product here, that is open source software and available freely because of the open source license. Then vendors can add some functionality, make self-help services available. They may charge for it, often don't. But this then is only sometimes commercial, adding to basic and whole product as complementary things to the free and open source software. But it isn't always commercial. So we will need to look at this in more detail. Here's an example. That is Jaspersoft. Has been acquired by TIBCO. Jaspersoft was business intelligence, commercial open source software vendor, and they sold a product consisting of multiple features through a direct sales channel, for example, to enterprise customers. So the product they sold was on-premise license sale with an update service, meaning would get the update fixes. So first year initial license, after that maintenance, so classic license sale, plus added utilities added from the perspective. There's the core open source software, but then there's additional functionality, plus documentation and training and 24/7 or 9x5 hotline and support. And so enterprise customers who would operate the software, the BI software, was one market. Another one were ISVs who would embed the BI engine in their own products, so they wouldn't need update services as much as they would need a perpetual license. So that was the same product or a variant of the product, simply bundling these features differently. And that was also a direct sale. What was unusual about Jaspersoft, which is one of the reasons why I'm bringing it up here, is that they, by way of a web store, also targeted the open source community, the free-loading users, as you might argue. They targeted the open source community as a potential customers base or a market. That particular market or market segment might be willing to buy documentation and maybe the withheld additional utilities that weren't available for free as open source software. Or the open source community using the software might run into problems with using it, and then Jaspersoft sold them incident-based support. So in incident-based support, you pick up the phone and you are charged for the time or just in the moment. So it's not a subscription, it's just a pay-as-you-go service. And it's unusual, actually, that these commercial open source firms cater to the open source community. And in terms of revenue, it's also questionable. I think Jaspersoft had less than 5% of its revenue from the open source community when we interviewed them about 10 years ago. So then, there are three core strategies to commercial open source that I want to discuss. Open source has become sustainable, as we know from the previous lectures, by moving on from the traditional community projects, open source community open source projects, to all these non-profit organizations, the foundations. But these are not commercial. They only lay the groundwork, arguably, for possible commercialization. But the foundations itself are all about getting along with each other under defined rules and not giving anyone a leg up. Now, we want to look today and next time at commercial open source, which are for-profit firms, the foundations are non-profit, and which have also made open source a sustainable phenomenon. And there are three different types of of for-profit open source, commercial open source firms. I call them single vendor open source firms, open source distributor firms, and service and support firms. And I want to look at them in steps. One way of distinguishing these three types, which come with a kind of patterned or templatized business model, are by intellectual property. That is a key differentiator that helps you tell these models apart. So single vendor open source firms usually exclusively own the software that the business is based on. You may not have been aware of it, but MySQL, the database company, then acquired by Oracle, always owned MySQL, the database software. They owned it and they just licensed all of it, in the case of MySQL, all of it. They licensed it out under an open source license, but they still owned it. They held the copyright and they were selling separately from the open source license the same software under a commercial license. It's called dual licensing. So single vendor open source firms are those which own the software and strive to be the single sole vendor who bases a business on that software. And as the OSS cache spreadsheet showed, it can be very attractive, and this means it can attract venture capital. The second type of commercial open source vendor which can attract venture capital and have outsized returns are the open source distributor firms. Unlike single vendor open source, they don't own the software their business is based on, but they own the intellectual property around those components, most notably knowledge and databases and configuration data that makes a large, otherwise disparate array of open source software components work with each other well. They don't own the software itself, but they know how to fit pieces together so that they work with each other nicely. That is important, or happens if it's a large piece of software like the Linux operating system. The Linux operating system consists of a large number of components, most notably the kernel, but then a lot of other additional pieces of software, subsystems, file system, tools around it, etc. Separate from single vendor and open source firms and open source distributor firms, there are service and support firms. They don't own the software. They may be working on the software with others, so they share in the IP, they don't dominate it, and they just service the software to paying customers. They support useful software. They typically don't attract venture capital because they don't scale easily. They only scale with people usually, like consulting firms, and that's not something that attracts venture capital. So looking at these companies, the challenge is always, if you give the product away for free, why would anyone become a paying customer? What would they be paying for? And hence the challenge is to use your power to the extent that you have it, to structure product and services in such a way that you maximize that conversion from user to paying customer. So if you own the software but you give it away for free, what is it that you use to entice your freeloading users to become paying customers? You do that, of course, and there are ways, and we will discuss it. And at the same time, you need to make sure that no competitor shows up and uses your open source software to compete with you. So you need to keep the competition away or at bay. And you do that for a purpose. You might wonder why even open source, in particular if I'm like in single vendor open source, I'm the main developer, why would I give my software away for free? And you do that because you want to benefit from the user community. So how to achieve that? So this is the crux of commercial open source. This is the key strategic challenge, the key product management challenge of commercial open source. And we need to look at it. So let's discuss the first and the dominant model of the three of commercial open source software, which I call single vendor open source software firms. So single vendor open source software is commercial open source software that is managed and owned and developed by a single vendor. So just one, and they keep everyone else away, every other commercial vendor away. And that's why it's single vendor open source. So that's the firm then, which provides such software, the single vendor open source software. The key here is that they develop the software, they make it available for free, but they do not lose control. In fact, they own all the control mechanisms that I've introduced a couple of lectures ago, and they will never let go of it. Specifically, or most importantly, they remain the sole copyright owner. They develop it in the first place, so the company or the firm owns the copyright, and as you will see, if they accept any outside contributions, they will request a copyright transfer to the company. The way this strategy works is that it really is proprietary software in the sense of there's a single proprietor, the single vendor open source firms. That there's a proprietor doesn't mean they don't give rights away. So it's not closed. Proprietary and closed does not mean the same. I would argue that single vendor open source firms are perhaps better called neo-proprietary software vendors, meaning the original closed source software vendors who got smarter realized they don't need to close off all software. In fact, there are benefits from not closing off all software, but they still want to be the only proprietor behind the software. This model has been around. It's in its third incarnation, or it's a third stage, in my opinion, or third generation. The first generation were the pioneers who figured out the model. They figured it out as they went along. They probably thought ahead, but I doubt they had a master plan and could perfectly predict the future. This is the generation of MySQL with the same name database, Sleepycat with the Berkeley database, Trolltag, which gave us Qt, and so forth. There's a second wave starting in the early 2000s where smart entrepreneurs and venture capitalists realized this commercial open source thing was a real viable strategy to disrupt existing incumbents in markets. And that second wave therefore focused on enterprise software, in particular if there was a somewhat limping incumbent that could be beaten. And hence we got Sugar CRM, MuleSoft, Jaspersoft, and so forth. So a lot of focus on CRM, not just because Siebel could possibly be beaten, but because it was also still a large untapped market. Same thing with BI, Jaspersoft, Pentaho, there were others. BI was also a big market. After the last recession, 2008-2009, we saw another set of a third wave or third generation of commercial open source firms come about, and they are marked by moving into the cloud. So we can see there are three distinct motivations or characteristics to each wave or generation. The first one just figured it out and was all over the place. The second one thought about it as a disruptive mechanism for incumbents in the enterprise software space, application space, and the current breed is using open source as an on-ramp to the cloud to pay for cloud service, as we will discuss in more detail in the next lecture. So here, just because I like logos, first and second generation single vendor open source firms, to give you some ideas, some of which you may know, many of which have been acquired. Most of them or many of them were successes, some were failures. It will be interesting to look both at successes and failures. The third generation is perhaps more interesting because that's where the action now is. We see a lot of databases because the cloud database market is so huge, far into the billions of euro. And all of these in one form or another try to bring users into their cloud as paying customers. That's the core strategy of almost all of these. Unlike the previous generation, the second generation, which was about enterprise applications, this generation, the third generation, the current generation, is about infrastructure. So components for building applications and a little bit of tooling for applications. An example of tooling would be Gradle, which many of you as developers, computer science students will know. That's a tool. But even Gradle is has moved into the cloud and is selling its customers a cloud service. The key to unlocking or understanding what it is that customers pay for is, as stated, the additional functionality provided by a basic or a whole product over something that's available for free. What is available for free is or has been traditionally called the community edition of the software, meaning that is the software as an artifact provided under an open source software license for free. The supporting company or vendor usually would provide some complementary materials, usually also for free, not necessarily under an open license, and usually also self-help services like forums, mailing lists, etc., where users could talk to each other and help each other. Complementary to the community edition is the commercial edition that customers now pay for. And it's at its core the same software, but under a commercial license. Again, here in single vendor open source, the company owns the software, owns the copyright, and therefore can multi-license provide the software under multiple licenses. In fact, if it's the owner, it can add functionality to the software that it withholds from the community edition, from the open source licensed software. So the core product could provide in the commercial edition additional functionality, important artifacts, important code that the open source version or the community edition does not provide. And then it's just business as usual. So the basic product is that core product with possibly some fitness of use or for use guarantees, certification guarantees on some hardware or some processes, and the whole shebang, training, consulting, and of course operations, meaning the cloud service. As explained, the core challenge will become now that you make something available for free as the community edition. That implies you have no customers. So how do you get your users, freeloading users, if you will, from the community edition to buy into the commercial edition, become paying customers? And that is a challenge to be discussed in detail. What it usually means is that you have stuck with the community edition home users, people who value their time less than their wallet. So they are willing to invest the time to figure out problems and solve them themselves. and they're unlikely to ever buy. As opposed to the enterprise, which may have started with the community edition, but values time and reliability much more than the home user, therefore is willing to pay for the commercial edition with the additional features and the support of the operations by the vendor. That enterprise customer is also the one which may require additional features, and here we are getting a hint at how to upsell or how to move users, company users using companies from freeloading to paying customer. They may require enterprise features, so authentication, authorization, what have you, stuff that you can withhold, possibly, I'm not saying you should, but can possibly withhold from the free version. The community edition often also is used by line of business users who like it, that they have to pay nothing for their own innovative application or for a component in there. And they may be kind of ignorant at the operating risks that come with using software for free, which will be very different from an internal IT department, which looks at the software and says like, no, we are not going to operate open source software. We are going to buy the commercial edition because we want support. We want to be able to call someone up and get resolution of problems within a defined time scope. The IT department wants that professional support and usually has a budget to pay for it. One more thing to discuss, which is important, is to understand that a lot of this hinges on the single vendor really being the owner of the underlying software. Being the owner means they can dual or multi-license. Being the owner means it's clear to potential competitors that the fight would be hard because they are at a disadvantage. They don't own the code. They only could use it through the open source license. And hence it is important for single vendor open source firms to remain the sole owner of the copyright and other important associated intellectual properties. It has led to what I call the intellectual property rights imperative of single vendor open source, which is that you should or must always act in such a way that you, the vendor, and only you possess the right to provide the open source project under a different commercial license of your choice. Could also be another open source license, we'll see about that. But the key is there should only be one company, and that company must maintain that possibility to multi-license the software. Because the software is available for free as open source software, you might get requests by users to incorporate their changes to your code. And these changes may be good, bug fixes, all right, but maybe even, or sometimes even, substantial feature enhancements or new features. If someone from the community comes and wants to make such a code contribution, the vendor absolutely, in order to comply with the intellectual property rights imperative, must acquire at a minimum the relicensing right to said contribution, but usually they will acquire the full copyright to that potential contribution. Hence, all single vendor open source firms, when offered by a community member some new functionality, will require a copyright transfer to the company from that community member to maintain full 100% ownership of the intellectual property their business is based on. So I talk about single vendor open source. Sometimes you also run into multi-vendor open source, which is mostly the same, works the same along the same logic, but is slightly different because in multi-vendor open source, there is no single sole owner of the core software or what's considered the core software. Rather, it's that core software is actual community open source software, and hence it's possible for multiple companies to provide complementary software and services, complementary software, such that they build their products on it, and then there are multiple competing products. So Hadoop is an example. Cloudera, Mapper, and Hortonworks were separate companies. I think they merged by now to provide services around Hadoop, products and services around Hadoop. They competed well, which was good for customers and the market, but again, they merged now. Kafka had Confluent, Ivan, and Instacluster competing, so that was a multi-vendor setup because Kafka is an Apache project, actually like Hadoop. These are all Apache projects here, so these are true community projects, and companies building on top of it would not own the core of the software. Another one yet is Lucene and Solar for search, so LucidWorks, Elastic, and SwiftType were separate vendors. Actually, some merged. I think Elastic bought SwiftType. So you see that you can have a multi-vendor situation, though often it's not entirely stable. And then in the end, it doesn't actually matter that the core is community open source software, because the main product based on top of it will come from a dominant vendor soon again. You need to think back to the control mechanisms. Copyright is only one way of dominating software. It's a very nice one because copyright and the associated exclusion right is very hard and easily to enforce in the comparatively can be enforced in the courts. But there are these other mechanisms, for example, social leadership. If a company employs all the committers, it can lock down a project, open source project, even a community open source project, to comply with its strategy as well. So, whether a single vendor and the occasional multi-vendor open source, that's one type or one basic pattern of commercial open source firms. Now I want to talk about the second one that attracts venture capital, open source distributor firms. An open source distribution, that's the established term, is a well-integrated collection of open source components and applications. So the focus is, it's this collection, potentially large set of components that has been turned into something where these different pieces, the elements of the set of or the collection, work together really well. And if this works together really well, is not so easy to achieve because it's a large set of components and because they are easily misconfigured, then there is significant value in making the pieces work together well, hence creating a distribution. And a company or a vendor which provides such an open source distribution is an open source distributor firm. The classic examples are the Linux distributors, of course, and Linux is complex with just a lot of components, so that made a lot of sense. This complexity that motivates a distribution and then a distributor firm comes from the individual, simply the sheer number of components, but also the complexity of a single component that you need to know about. So a Linux distributor absolutely needs to have competence in the actual inner workings of the Linux kernel, even though that's just one component of many. And then how the components work with each other, how to keep them up to date, which versions are compatible, etc. The commercial open source distributor hides this complexity from the user for pay. And if a user were to solve all of this by themselves, they would probably fail. Otherwise, the distributor wouldn't survive in the market if it was that easy. Distributors are different from single vendor open source firms, so the set of those is different because there are a large number of very different single vendor open source firms, but the number and type of open source distributor firms is much smaller. Most notably, when people hear distributor, they will always think Linux distributors because that's the biggest part. And so we have Linux distributor firms, the original SUSE, then Red Hat, today also Canonical, which gives us Ubuntu, but also niche distributors like the German Bremen-based Univention, which provides a Linux distribution for schools and public government. They simply have a niche focus there. Beyond Linux, there isn't actually that much, but there are some, so it's not just Linux. For a while, the most notable example was OpenStack distributions. So there are a couple like Mirantis, vScaler, Fujitsu, Wind River, OpenStack distributions. Why? Because OpenStack is also really complicated and complex, like the Linux operating system, and it needed a lot of competence to make the whole stack, the components in the stack work together. That integration challenge was so big that we got OpenStack distributors. And then in different domains and for different software, there are different distributions, often just one or two, so not necessarily a large market. So Acquia provides a Drupal distribution, but also provides additional functionality. Easy Eclipse made the Eclipse IDE, programming IDE, easy to use because, as everyone who ever tried to use Eclipse knows, the plugins that you would load into Eclipse to focus on a particular domain would easily contradict each other and nothing would work. So yes, even a 15 component distribution sometimes makes sense if the integration is so onerous and hard to make work that you really just want to pay someone to take that pain away from you. Hallo Welt is a Regensburg-based distributor of MediaWiki, meaning the MediaWiki software that runs, for example, Wikipedia, but for commercial entities, for businesses. That's the core software, MediaWiki, plus lots of plugins. And for distributor firms, we also usually have a distinction or separation of a community edition from a commercial edition. You don't always need that community edition because you can argue people can use existing distributions. There are always some, like Debian in the case of Linux. But often these distributor firms utilize community editions to utilize a community to learn about problems and to also have the community figure out integration woes, and such that the company has to employ less people to do that. An example for such community editions would be Fedora for Red Hat, even though it's a separate piece of software. Canonical has Ubuntu and Ubuntu, OpenSUSE versus SUSE Linux Enterprise Server, and so forth. Key here is that the distributors will sell you the core open source software. Because they don't own it, they can't sell it to you under a commercial license, but they sell your commercial license for anything else that is not the open source software. So, for example, if they provide additional software they don't open source themselves, they'll give you sell your commercial license for that. And then the whole thing of complementary products and services, basic product and whole product. That's just a lot of additional things to sell, which is why we broke down what constitutes software products for you in previous lectures. Key again is that distributor firms do not exclusively own the copyright to the code, but they do exclusively own all that knowledge in whatever way it gets encoded on how to build the distribution from its components, how to configure and make compatible these components so that they work together well, how to react to support requests, etc., and how to test the whole thing, among other things. It's what's in between the components that these distributors own, and that constitutes their unique and exclusive intellectual property. Sometimes this doesn't become explicit and is just embedded in people they employ, though most companies hate that and they will try to get it out of people into documentation and what have you. So then the final of the three version of the three parent business models is our service and support firms. These are not supported usually or cannot acquire venture capital simply because they are more like consulting firms. They service community open source software, they participate in its development, but there are no barriers to entry for competing firms usually. If there were, they would be sliding over into single vendor open source country, the domain. And hence they will not dominate the committers or own all or employ all the committers, and all the revenues they can make in some form or another usually scales with the labor, the people they employ to service customers, meaning more projects, more customers, only with more people. What's good is that they help make open source sustainable because they contribute to the open source projects that the business is based on, and that is of course good and makes it successful. So, and I finally would like now to take a look at why, and you may have asked yourself that, why do companies who acquire venture capital, like the single vendor open source firms, why do they open source the software they own because they developed it, paid for by venture capital or through other ways? They own that software. Why do they make it available for free? So what's the reasoning behind the commercial open source strategy as opposed to being a classic traditional software vendor? And the reality is that really every single business function is somehow affected by the software vendor making a core of its intellectual property available for free as open source software. Marketing can generate leads more broadly, faster, cheaper. There's this whole user community, a factor multiple 10 or 100 times larger, 1,000 times larger sometimes, than the actual customer base that you could possibly upsell or cross-sell. So marketing can, as a large treasure trove of potential of leads, users that are leads, to fish in and feed to sales. Sales actually then, if you identified or have qualified leads from that user community, can sell more efficiently because of the open source strategy, and I will actually look at that in more detail in a few slides. Business development can identify partners faster, better. Product management gets ideas faster. Software development gets some of its work, not all, not the coding, but some of it done by users and so forth. So let me take a look at first marketing, but then more importantly sales. So in marketing, looking at the sales funnel, where marketing is responsible for the initial stages until initially unknown people or companies become qualified leads when they hand it over to sales. Marketing, which manages the initial stages, the broad stages of the sales funnel, can do so more effectively because it has these users out there who, first of all, are themselves potentially qualified leads, but they help market the product. If you have users, not paying customers, just users who are happy, then they will help evangelize you, or you can help them or lead them to evangelize your product and make it even more widely known and get your free software, open source software into more people's hand, into more companies who are initially just using the free version. And that multiplies the power of an otherwise also always resource constrained marketing department. It's that benefit of frictionless distribution of the open source afforded by the open source license for the so licensed software. It drives adoption in the marketplace where users may not be paying in the beginning, but may be paying later. How later? Well, let's say marketing identified qualified leads. So how would you know that some company is a qualified lead and that sales maybe should kick in? Well, perhaps a company or someone with a company email address is asking lots of questions in your forums. They may not be using the commercial edition, they may be using the open source software, but maybe they have lots of questions. Maybe you can see how they are asking questions that suggest they would be better served by your commercial version. And that's how that's one way of identifying qualified leads that could possibly become customers. But let's take a step back. Let's look at sales in general. First of all, a commercial open source software product, be it single vendor or a distribution, is just a product. And hence you have a classic sales force usually, which will try to sell the product in established ways. Established ways means you go to fairs and you acquire your qualified leads there, and then you call them up, or salespeople call up the companies who showed up at your booth or who reacted to some advertisement in a magazine, what have you. And these are all traditional ways of how you get in touch with customers or they get in touch with users, how interested parties get in touch with you, the vendor, or how you get in touch with potentially interested leads and convince them to buy. Sometimes companies will have a request for a proposal out, are looking for a product, for example, a new database software, and then all the vendors or some vendors will show up and you will compete with them, or the single vendor open source firm, the commercial open source firm will compete with them in a competitive sales situation, like in classic, like in the old days, and sometimes you may win, sometimes you may lose. However, that competitive sales situation is particularly interesting if the company seeking to buy is already a user of your open source software, free open source software, not paying, but is using it, for example, in a line of business. And now the IT department wants to buy such a type of software, wants to fill the category, oh, we need a CRM software, or we need a new database software. Then the open source strategy kicks into full gear. So what's happening here? Again, let's take a step back. You laid the groundwork by making available for free good software as open source software. You smartly are kind of tracking who is using it. Innocuously, you ask users, who are you? Would you care about updates? Why don't you give us your email address? And if someone from a company comes, they probably won't give you their personal email address. They'll give you their company email address because They care about your software only from a business perspective, so it's daily work, and hence they use their whatever email address at a bank, for example, if they work for a bank. Now you're tracking your users. You have at least the information about it. If you're smart, you lay the groundwork as soon as you learn that, say, from a large potential customer organization, there are multiple users, maybe in different lines of business, who are using your software. Then you will ask them, would you like to know about other people in your organization who are using our software? Would you be willing, would you let us give them your email address? So you connect these users with the goal of making them talk to each other, helping each other, creating a community of users, not just individuals, in that potential customer organization. As I also mentioned, as you track users, you see how they are engaged with you in your forums, for example, for the free version. All of that helps you to identify who in the potential customer organization might be championing your software, might like it, think it's great software, knows how to handle it, knows its weaknesses, but also knows its strength, and might be willing to vouch for you. Why and when? Well, exactly when in that competitive sales situation there are multiple competing companies, and you're the one now, because you're the commercial open source vendor who identified that champion in the business organization, you're the one who can say, well, these other folks, they are unknown to you, dear potential customer, but we can give you addresses, internal people, internal to your company, who know us, who can tell you whether we are good or not so good. And then, of course, you name them your champion. So, and you will have someone inside the buying organization who may vouch for you. So effectively summarizing here, what's happening is that by way of open source, you get a foot in the door of potential customers, broadly and widely, because you're free to use your $0 line item and a budget for some departmental project that eventually gets reined in by IT, and then they want to figure out which product to use, but now they have the lines of business which vouch for you as opposed to other competitors who are completely unknown. So you get the foot in the door by way of frictionless distribution. Companies know you, you know them long before the actual sales situation emerges on a large scale. And when the competitive sales situation happens, you're prepared to sell better and more effectively. So this is how, for example, Martin Mykos of MySQL used to tell the story about a big bank where MySQL won big because it was already in use by 5 different lines of business when IT finally wanted to buy MySQL. And they just won hands down when competing with much more established closed source vendors who did not have the advantage of being in the buying organization already. So I dwelled a little bit on sales. It really just was my pick because it's kind of instructive what the benefits are, and I don't have to talk about regular software development as much where it may be more obvious. It's really every business function that benefits. For example, business development, strategic partnering benefits because your software is out there as open source. Users use it and they use it in their context. And if some users repeatedly combine your product with some other vendor's product and it's also open source, that helps you identify strategic partners. So for example, Sugar CRM and Jaspersoft identified each other as potential strategic partners because there were a non-trivial number of users who combined these two products using the free versions, but they combined it, and so these two companies identified that maybe they could work together and provide a stronger offering to customers. Product management can learn so much from creative users. The users identify the requirements more broadly because they request things more broadly than just existing customers could do. The users are willing to pay with their time. They explore potential market segments for you for free. They explore the feature space, etc. All of this for no cost or very little cost, meaning your attention, the product manager's attention to them. Software development has some benefits. It's not that the community develops code. They do so sometimes, but it's not a lot because users aren't stupid. They know that you're a commercial endeavor that gets much less contributions than a real community open source project, but they will file bugs. If something's wrong, they will find bugs, they will file them, tell you about them, so you get bug reports for free. The coding is really just a part of the overall software development expense, and just the time of the users, free users, can be very beneficial to your cost efficiency and development effectiveness. Support can learn from users who help themselves, who explore issues and document things that your own support can't handle because it's too expensive to hire more people, maybe. And then you may wonder, all of this for free? Well, not entirely. You need smart people who can take advantage of these benefits. They need to understand how these business functions are being changed by a commercial open source strategy. It's not rocket science. They can understand it, but it's new, so they may not be as effective as they might be in the traditional closed source vendor situation. More importantly, though, you do need a new business function called community management. And most likely, so in every class, when I run this course, we will have a community manager talk about how to work with community open source projects in a community. But you need to have that community manager, and that is an additional cost that you incur. So with that, let me close. We discussed what commercial open source is and how there are 3 core strategies, 2 of which can make real money and are venture capital funded, and how and why companies do this. We discussed by business function, how the business functions change and which benefits result from the commercial open source strategy. So that's it from me for today. Thank you very much for your attention, as always, and see you next time.